Over the last few weeks, we've fished some major team competitions, and it's been the height of summer and big fish have been very, very unpredictable. So those matches have all been about small fish. We've got on to do really well by catching large numbers of small fish on the feeder, and that's what we're here to do today. We're here at the beautiful Damflask reservoir just outside Sheffield, and it's gonna be all about small fish. Now when we're fishing like this, it's quite often the best approach is really just to fish one line. Simple as that. Keep it nice and simple. On these deeper reservoirs, quite often fish are up in the water. We know they're up in the water, so you're trying to draw fish down all the time. We're obviously talking about feeder fishing, so the only way you can draw fish down properly is by fishing one line, because you've constantly got a feeder falling through the water, and that is what hopefully is going to draw some fish down to the bottom where they're going to be easier to catch. Now, when you're going to fish one line, it's obviously very important that that line it's free from snags. You know, you can't just clip up on your reel and then hope that it's not going to be landing in a pile of rocks or any sort of soft silt. It's important to just get an idea of what depth you're fishing in and see what the bottom's like. So the first thing I would do is I'd clip on. For me, it's always a 30-gram bottle bomb. I always use the same one on every single venue, because then it's much more uniform across different venues. And what I'll basically do is get the bomb out there. I cast the bomb out. As soon as the bomb hits the surface, put my finger on the line and I actually count. In my case, I actually use a stopwatch because it's far more accurate, and I take account of how long it takes for the bomb to hit the bottom. And by doing that in different areas of the swim, it's going to give you a picture, an idea of what it's actually like out there. I've already done this, and I've got a gradual slope. As you can see, the typography of the bank, that is very much reflected out there underneath the water. So all I will basically do is go out, hit the clip, in this case, because I've already clipped up. When the bomb hits the surface, start the stopwatch and then stop it when it hits the bottom. And that is a reading of exactly 2.8 seconds. Our best guess, or the best average, if you want to get an idea of how deep that is with a 30-gram bottle bomb like that, the average is 1 meter of depth per second. Simple as that. So that would suggest, obviously, that's telling us we're fishing in just under 3 meters of water, which I think is going to be about right. And to give you an idea of what this peg's like, I didn't know till I got here, it just gradually keeps getting deeper and deeper. So much so that even just over halfway, it actually goes off to just over 9 meters in depth, which is incredibly deep, isn't it? We are fishing in summer conditions. It's still very warm, so we're expecting fish being in that shallower water, and that's why I've selected to fish in just under 3 meters. And as it turns out, once I found that depth, I'm happy with that. I've dragged the bomb around on the bottom to make sure it's nice and clean. I've then gone to the measuring sticks, and it works out at exactly 20 meters. So that's the line we're going to be focusing on. Well, we're only fishing 20 meters, so as you can imagine, we don't need a long rod. But if you can just see the conditions behind me, conditions can change. And because of that, on these venues, you've got to bear in mind all those factors that might be thrown at you when you're looking at the tackle choice for fishing like this. Now, we're after small fish. We're only fishing 20 meters, so I'm actually selected an 11-foot rod. I think 11-foot rod's ideal. And this is actually, it's an XRF medium feeder. The reason why I've picked a medium feeder is because if that wind increases, just like it's threatening to now, it means that we've got a rod that's still going to allow us to fish that range comfortably. We've also said that the depth gets deeper, it gets deeper the further out we go as well. We might find the fish aren't in the depth that we've chosen to fish. We might have to go further out. So by having a rod like this, it just means that yes, you can fish at short range comfortably, but it's going to allow me to go further if I need to. I've got that coupled with an Horizon 3000 reel. Absolutely brilliantly balanced. A 3000 reel on an 11-foot rod is fantastic. This rod is rated at 45 gram, so it's a really nice balanced setup. I've got the reel loaded with 0.10 submerged braid. I've got a 5 meter 8-pound shock leader on that as well, and that is coupled with a 1 ounce tip. And that's all we're really going to be using to tackle this peg. I'm fishing it with a free running rig, and that's because it gives me flexibility as regards setting my tip, reading bites, and that's something we can talk about a little bit later on. But we're going to get some bait out there, see if there are some fish on that chosen line, and I'm pretty confident we're going to be getting a few bites quite early on. because we're targeting small fish, we are going to be going down a non-fish meal ground bait route. That is basically the mix that I've got today. Is a 50-50 combination of the So Natural Black and the Sweet Skimmer. It's a fantastic all-round mix, but as the name suggests, there isn't any fish meal in it, and that's because I want to be targeting roach, perch, and any small skimmers that might be out there, and that's a great all-round mix for that. Now, initially, we're obviously faced with a large reservoir here, and I need somehow to draw fish into the swim, and I'm going to be doing that by using the ground bait mix in a quite a dry state to start with. I want some activity there. We know it's nearly 3 seconds deep out there, and I want to get some ground bait falling through the water because I want to draw some fish into the swim. So I'm going to be kick-starting it with a cage feeder. That is purely because a cage feeder like this with a fine wire mesh, it means the water can get to the ground bait really nice and quickly, and it can empty quickly as well. So to kickstart the swim, I'm just going to put 3 feederfuls of bait out there. I'm going to be starting with hemp and castor. Hemp can be a great bait. It's a great holding bait, you know. Once again, that's one of the baits that we use a lot if you were pole fishing here or fishing with a waggler. We use it a lot in float fishing, so why not transfer that over into our feeder fishing? So I'm going to kickstart the swim with 2 feederfuls of hemp and castor. All right, I'm only going to lightly squeeze that. You don't want to be squeezing it really tight because we're going to be emptying it straight away, and I want some of that to empty on the way down. So I'm just going to put 2 of those in. I'm lined up with my far back marker. I'm just going to put 2 of those on this line, which is 20 metres. And what I want to do is the first 2 I'm going to put in, I'm actually going to empty them on the bottom. So that's on the bottom now already, and all I'm going to do is just strike that out. Because this ground bait's quite dry, you've got plenty of activity coming off it. We can obviously change that later on in the session if we need to, but this first few minutes, we're just trying to draw some fish in. There's no reason why those fish would already be in front of me, you know, because venues like this, you know, they don't get fished too heavily. So I need to get some activity there to draw some fish into the swim. So I'm going to let that hit the bottom. That's hit the bottom now, so I'm going to strike that out. So that's 2 feederfuls in, and then what I'm going to do next, this 3rd feederful, I'm going to squeeze this one even lighter. Even lighter. I'm not going to put any bait in it. So it's really lightly squeezed like that. And what I'm going to do with this one is, I'm going to empty this one before it hits the bottom. So I've got 2 feederfuls in there that's down on the deck. So that's down on the bottom now. And then this one, I'm literally going to count to 1, and empty it. So what we've got there is a nice big cloud of ground bait that's now falling through the water, hopefully drawing fish in from around this area, but more importantly, drawing fish down to the bottom. If that feederful I've just put in now draws any fish in, the first 2 feederfuls of bait are already down there, so that's nice and settled, where we can get a hook length on now and just find out if there's some fish out there. I'm kicking off with a 1 metre hook length. Now, it's an MXB2 size 16 I'm starting off with, just to see if we can get some bites. I've no idea what to expect. However, I have got predictions. I strongly suspect a metre hook length is probably too long. I think we might be missing bites, and we might even be able to step up to a 14, but we don't know. At this stage, we just want to see if there are even any fish out there. So I'm going to kick off with a single white maggot, live maggots, and I'm going to keep a few grains of hemp, a few casters going in. I have got some pinkies as well, but I think we're going to be targeting mainly roach, I think. I'm sure there are going to be 1 or 2 skimmers around, hopefully, but I think it's mainly roach and perch, so that's why I'm sticking with the hemp and castor to start with. But like I say, I can switch to pinkies, and I've also got some worms as well, if I need to chop worms. So I'm just looking for bites initially. That wind's dropped now, but I've got a 1 ounce tip on, but like I say, I'm fishing with braids, so we should see any indications. That 1 metre hook length is obviously, it's going to help us catch any fish if there are fish up in the water. Because it's a metre long, it's obviously going to give that maggot much more time to fall through the water. And it might take a few casts of just getting that feeder going in, getting some ground bait falling through the water to try and draw some fish in. As we know, we can go further out into deeper water if we feel we need to. But these first few casts are just to get to feel for if there's any fish there, and if there are, we'll get a chance to see what they are. And one thing, you know, over the last few matches that we've fished on different venues, we've fished the River Trent, we've fished Rudyard Lake, where we've been fishing for small fish, it has, on all those venues, paid to be quite active. And I've just picked up there, and there's a fish on. So I didn't actually see a bite. And this is what can happen when you've got a long hook length on. You know, if the fish is not going to swim off with the bait, that's a nice little fish to start with. There we go. Nice little skimmer. So I didn't actually see the bite, but obviously we've caught a fish, so it's telling us there's 1 or 2 fish there, but it might also be telling us that when the fish take the bait, they're not swimming off out of the peg, because if it had done that, I would have seen a bite, wouldn't I? So we've got us bite, which is good. And so now it's just a case of, if there are fish there in numbers, it's a case of obviously turning bites into fish. That's the key thing. And if you can keep coming back with a fish, when you're fishing like this, that is it's your goal, that is your target. If you're getting a bite every cast, you want to be getting a fish every cast. And like we've always said that when you are fishing like this, just like when you're speed fishing, if you can come back with a fish every cast, see, there we go, another fish. If you can come back with a fish every cast, you're going to make yourself very, very difficult to beat, because the only way anybody can beat you is either by catching fish quicker than you. So that's a good stamp roach. The only way they can beat you is by catching fish quicker than you, or by catching bigger fish. And as we've already mentioned, bigger fish can be very, very unpredictable, can't they? And that's a position you don't want to really be in. But they're nice roach. Lovely stamp. And as you saw, that was as soon as the feeder hit the bottom. So we've had a skimmer and a roach. So it's telling us that there are obviously some fish out there. Now, one of the things that some people struggle with, and I've seen this happen a hell of a lot, is that when you're fishing with long hook lengths like this, some people struggle when they're filling the feeder about where to put the hook and all that sort of thing. And on this sort of venue, we're fishing with a barbed pattern hook. They can be getting caught on your foot plate and around your waterproof bottoms, anything. That's why waders can be fantastic for fishing this sort of venue, for 2 reasons, just while we're on the subject. One is obviously your hook doesn't get caught in them, so when you're fishing with longer hook lengths, it helps with that. But the other reason as well is, and you probably saw me do that, is that when you're swinging small fish in, it's quite easy for small fish to spin off the hook. So when you swing a fish in, rather than catch the fish itself, it can often pay to actually catch them here, so that they're not spinning off the hook and you're not losing fish. You know, I saw some anglers at the weekend losing fish like that. They were trying to catch fish and they were spinning off the hook and they were dropping down here. And on some matches, obviously, you don't want to be losing fish like that. So by having waders on like this and waterproofs, you can catch the fish here. But basically, once I've put the hook bait on the hook like that, all I basically do is, with my finger and thumb on the hand that I'm holding the rodded, I actually grab the hook length halfway. If you grab it halfway, you can hold it there, out of the way, and then that leaves your left hand free, and the distance is nice, just for you to fill your feeder. And look how it's keeping the hook away from me. It's keeping it away from the foot plate, and it's just nice and smooth. And when you're ready to cast, you can just swing the cast forward like that. Get the tip down under the water, because as that feeder's sinking, you want to give that braid the best possible chance of sinking. So it's down out of the way of the wind, and all the time you're watching for bites. Like I say, we're fishing 20 metres, fishing with braid, so you should see all your bites. I'm getting little indications there. And like I say, I'm expecting, see, there we go, we've got another fish. I'm expecting that we might have to shorten that hook length, but at the moment it's working all right, so there's no need to change it. Well, there we go. Did you see that pike? A pike's just had a go at that, literally 4 metres out. You are a very lucky roach, very lucky roach. So we've had 3 and 3 casts. It's working all right, there's no need to change anything. We've just seen a pike at 4 metres. That is something that you've got to contend with on these sorts of venues. Now obviously that pike was very close in, so we're going to be expecting that if it's going to be striking at fish on the way in. But what you've also got to remember is that those pike could be out there at 20 metres right next to where you're fishing. So sometimes when you're catching fish like what we are doing now, if the swim suddenly goes dead, a lot of people automatically assume it's because they've done something wrong. It might not be the case. You know, it's the nature of the beast. There could be pike out there as well. So that's something that you just need to bear in mind. We all carry loads and loads of feeders, and one of the things that a lot of people overlook is just why different feeders are designed in different ways. Now, there are different feeders for different jobs, and on a session like this, you know, we're really looking at 3 different types of feeders that we will usually use when we're fishing this sort of range, which is 20 meters. Obviously, if we were going past that, we would be looking at a different style feeder altogether, but for this initial period, we'd kick off with a normal, what we call a normal side weighted feeder. So this is the most common type, and to be quite honest, if we could cast this style feeder up to any sort of a range, then this is really the style of feeder that we'd use for the vast majority of our fishing. However, due to the design of it, it's not incredibly aerodynamic, so sometimes you are limited as regards how far you can cast a feeder like this. But under the current conditions, on this 20 meter line, that is the feeder we'll kick off with. And that's a great feeder just because it's 20 grams, so we can get to 20 meters no problem. And the weight is on the side, which means the feeder sits that way. So that's the feeder that I'll use all day if I can get away with it. However, if the wind becomes tricky, particularly from left or right, when you get a side wind like that, with a side weighted feeder like that, a side wind can often cause it to spin. It's just that, you know, that's just what happens with this design feeder. And if that starts to happen, if that wind gets a little bit stronger, that is when we'll switch to what we call a weight forward feeder. And as the name suggests, the weight is on the bottom, and that's because when you cast it out, it's going to be the weight that takes you out there. It's round, so it's not going to spin like a side weighted feeder. It's the same weight, 20 gram, and the actual capacity size of the actual cage itself is the same as well. So that's the one that we'll be using if that wind gets a little bit tricky. And then the third feeder is one that we tend to use more in deeper water, and this is the feeder that we tend to use when you're trying to just make sure that your bait ends up on the bottom, that your bait is only going to exit the feeder on the bottom, and that's when we'd switch to a plastic feeder. Okay, it's a much more solid feeder, as we refer to them as, or an open-ended feeder. Again, it's side weighted, but it's the plastic here that's the key, because what that plastic does is protect the ground bait from the water. It stops the ground bait exiting the feeder until it hits the bottom. Obviously, that depends on how tightly you pack the ground bait in there, but this will encourage the feeder to hit the bottom intact, so that the only time when the bait will exit from that feeder is either A, if I decide to twitch the feeder or move the feeder, I could just drag it along the bottom and that'll deposit the bait out on the bottom, or obviously when I retrieve the feeder, that will leave feed on the bottom. So that's the style feeder that we'll use if the peg gets a little bit too lively. Sometimes you can have too much ground bait coming off your mix, too many small fish up in the air, up in the water, and that can lead to line bites, miss bites. If that happens, I'll switch to that sort of feeder to just kind of slow the peg down and get the bait on the bottom, which is where hopefully, because the bait's focused on the bottom, that is where the fish are going to be, where ultimately they should be easier to catch. But this is a trio of feeders that we use on lots and lots of different venues, and depending on the conditions that you're faced with, don't be afraid to change. Sometimes just by changing the feeder can transform your swim. That's 2 or 3 bites I've missed in consecutive casts, so I think it's time for a change. It's been working quite well actually, that 1 meter hook length, been hitting most bites, but now it's just kind of gone a little bit. I've just missed 3 in 3 casts, so obviously I don't want that pattern to continue. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make 2 changes really. It's not often I make 2 changes in one go, but I just feel it's going to be right. The first thing is I'm going to shorten that hook length. All right, so that is 1 meter. I'm going to shorten it down to about 70 centimeters. I don't want to just completely halve it, but I'm just going to go down to about 70 centimeters. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to step up the hook. I'm going to step up the hook size to a size 14. And then what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to switch to the head of a worm or a piece of worm, because it's much more durable. As you can imagine, when you're fishing with single maggot, like I am doing now, when you are getting bites, you've only kind of got 1 or 2 bites at the cherry, as they say, because obviously if you're sitting there and you wasn't sure if it was a bite, you've not picked up, the maggot could be squashed, it could be bust or even come off the hook, so you're sitting there without a bait on. With a piece of worm, it's much more durable, it's much more robust, and you can have several bites at it. And it also means that when we are catching fish, quite often with worm, you can catch multiple fish on the same piece of worm, particularly on a worm head. And because I'm fishing a worm head, that is going to hopefully allow me to get away with a size 14 hook, which is going to make bringing the fish in much easier, much quicker. And when we've got pike hanging around like we have done, like we have got now, obviously with a bigger hook on, it's going to let me just reel those fish in that little bit quicker. Well, there's 2 or 3 things that we can do when we're fishing like this. When you're getting lots of bites, obviously it's all about efficiency. You want to be hooking bites, all that side of it. But you've got to think about the time when you're out of the water and the things that you do to try and increase your chances of hitting more bites and coming back with a fish. So one of the first things I do when I'm fishing like this is I always have a bait bowl like that next to me, just with a small amount of bait in, and that is basically the mix. That is what I'm actually feeding through the feeder. When we're fishing like this, you know, the time that your rig is out of the water is potentially costing you fish. So what I do is I have a small tub just right at the front of my bait tray, where in there I've got some casters in there, I've got some hemp, and just sprinkling of pinkies. And that is just so that when I reel in, like I have done now, I can quickly just grab the feeder into the mix and I'm ready to go again. All right, it just speeds everything up, and whilst I'm actually out there fishing, I can keep adding bait to that as it runs out and just keep varying the quantities as well if I wish. If I decide I don't want to feed as much, then the next batch won't have as much feed in. So once I get the feeder out there, it's just a case of hitting the clip, put the rod down, and then the rod is on the feeder rest. And as you can see, I'm using the wide, smooth feeder rest. Now the reason why we use this style when we're feeder fishing like this, or when we're fishing quickly, is for a couple of reasons. One is, when you're tightening up to the feeder or you want to sink your braid, I don't have to use the reel if I don't want. What I can actually do is simply slide the feeder rod along the arm, so you're not getting any downtime from actually watching your tip. If I had a bite at any stage there, I can quickly and easily just pick up. I'm constantly in contact with the way that the tip is set. And this style of feeder arm allows you to do that. And I could even tighten it up even more by moving the feeder arm, or moving the rod further over like that. And if I decide that's too much bend in the tip, if I want a slack line, well, I could just move it there. So I've got a nice slack line, which is something we do when we're skimmer fishing or bream fishing, when we want to just slacken that line off and wait for a fish to take the bait properly. And then the ultimate thing, the final thing, which is really important, and it's something that I know a lot of people overlook, and that is, I've got the rod on my knee. I haven't got any sort of a butt rest here, and that's because you need the rod across your knee. You need to be holding the rod when you're fishing like this. On many occasions, you're hitting every single little indication, and the only way you can do that is by having the rod in your hand, having it ready to go like that, you know. So these 3 things are things that, you know, they're not directly related to what's happening out there, but it's speeding you up the time that you're not actually having a rig out there. And it just means that by having a rod on your knee as well, and a nice feeder arm like that where you can position the rod in different locations, it's just going to give you a little bit more flexibility, and hopefully it's going to result in more fish. Well, that change has really worked. We thought it was going to work anyway, but there's no given rules to this, you know. Things are never quite the same. That looks like it's a nice little skimmer. Just on that bit of worm. So durable, a bait like that. That's multiple fish I've caught on that. I must have caught 5, 6 fish on that piece of worm now. It just speeds everything up, makes it much more efficient. Shorter hook length. I've actually shortened it up even more, so that's it's just over 50 centimetres long now. And it's got enough of a drop to catch fish early, but when it does settle, there isn't loads and loads of line on the bottom, so we're still seeing the bite as well. So that's working really, really well now. The only other thing I've had to change is I've changed the feeder a couple of times, but that's something that you have to do whenever you're fishing, you know. Sometimes you have to switch from a side-weighted feeder to a forward-weighted one, just because of the wind. But these are the changes that you're constantly making, just like a plastic feeder has had a place as well today at certain times. So it's that change, it's worked brilliantly now. I'm catching everything on a worm, but I haven't introduced any worm. But it's obviously, you know, when you're nipping a worm off like that, it's the same size as a caster, which is what we are feeding. But if you can get your hook bait that's much more durable like that on a shorter hook length, it's just going to speed everything up. Well, it's only been a short session, but it's been quite hectic. It's been the kind of day where we didn't know what to expect. And as it's turned out, the fish have really responded to the feed. We've had a lovely split mix of roach and skimmers. We've had some perch in there as well. But it's been a really interesting day because there's been fish there, but we've had to keep ringing those changes to keep the fish coming, especially in between the pike that kept visiting us every now and then. So we really hope you've picked up a few tips from this video. We've had some beautiful fish. Look at that for a roach. So we're going to get these popped back now. We hope you've enjoyed it. Hope you've picked up a few tips, and we hope they're going to help you catch more fish the next time you're out on the bank. So thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time.